Hi, good morning. My name is Anusuriya. I'm a data scientist. So I think previous speaker were talking about making analytics. So that's what I do. I'm from the Pangea team. Pangea is, as you can see, is a digital repository for Earth and environmental sciences data sets, jointly managed by Alfred Wegener Institute for Marine and Polar and Marine Research and Center for Marine Information Sciences of University of Bremen. So this Pangea has been operating since 1993, so it's more than 2 decades now. We have scientific data set all around the world, including from marine cruises, national as well as international projects. And anybody can use this repository to actually archive their scientific data sets. All right, so let's get started. That's introduction to the, how do I use it? Oh, yeah. All right, so I will start with a basic question which I want to address the participants, because I know you will ask me some question at the end. So how much do you know about FAIR principles? I would like to be a bit interactive here. Who haven't heard about the principles? Okay, because you arrived late, sorry, because Professor Matjaž have introduced the principles, so no worries. Who have heard about it? I assume everybody have heard about it today, but don't know much about it. Can you please raise your hand? All right. And who know the principle, but not in detail? Okay, they have also a few people here. And who are the experts, the FAIR champion? Great. All right, so we have a different group of users. So I have divided the presentation into 2 parts. During the first part, I will give you an overview of FAIR data, the importance of FAIR data in the context of research data management. And the second part, I will introduce the project called FAIR project. And Pangea is one of the partners of the project. And I will specify how the project support FAIR data assessment. So, the title of the talk is FAIR Assessment of Research Data. What is research data? Research data is any information that has been collected, observed, or created for validating scientific findings. Consider, for example, data set collected through sensor, field observation, surveys, experimental data from laboratories, specimen, audio or videos, and workflows and programs. So the next keyword is FAIR. What is FAIR? So FAIR are high-level guidelines to improve the findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability of any digital resources for humans as well as machines. Machines mean computers. So example of digital resources are like research data, software, workflow, and so on. So basically, you can consider FAIR principle as a high-level guideline that users should consider when they share their data, such a way that you can, and these principles are important to actually maximize the use and reuse of data. FAIR has been highly recommended and endorsed by several entities, including funders like the EC, European Commission, publisher, and also research communities. Basically, there are 15 principles in total, which are grouped into four groups. So I'm not going to detail in each of these criteria, but I'm going to give you some kind of a key concept. What are these principles about? So the first group is about findability. Basically, what these principles put emphasis on the assigning persistent identifier to your research data, and then also providing relevant metadata that are required to actually search the data. So this is the principle about. And the second group is about accessibility. This refers to the implementing standard communication protocol that allow user to easily access the data as well as the metadata. And the third group is about interoperability. This put emphasis on using a shared formal vocabularies that provide meaningful description of your data. And the last one is about reusability. This group of principle focuses on the providing contextual information about the data, for example, the provenance of the data, how the data is created, and as well as usage license of the data, which is an important aspect when you reuse the data. So let's look in detail few of those principles. So the most probably important principle is data is assigned with globally unique and persistent identifier. So what does it globally mean? So this is a data set about paleomagnetic data set curated by GFZ. GFZ stands for German Research Center for Geosciences. And this data set is assigned with a persistent identifier based on DOI. So this is we call persistent identifier. And this identifier is globally unique because this identifier only associated with this particular data set. You can't associate it more than one data set to an identifier. So this is what we mean like globally unique, because this identifier is only belong to this data set. What does it persistent mean? Persistent means that this identifier is stable and it remains associated to the data set for a long time of period. So for example here, this is the URL. If you copy the URL, you can access this data set, but this URL might change over time, right? So sometimes people move to different server or you update the page, this URL will change. But since this data set is assigned with this identifier, through the persistent registration service, it binds this identifier to this URL, which means that when you use this identifier in the data sites, in your publication or report, this identifier is fixed. So when you copy this identifier in the browser, this will resolve to the data page where you can access the data. So this is what we call permanent. So let's say if this URL is changed, this data set just need to update the URL. So just need to update, but this identifier remains same. So to conclude, persistent identifier means that the identifier is stable and it is maintained and it remains associated to the location where you can access data set for a long time of period. Yeah. All right, so the second principle, the F4 principle says that metadata is registered, indexed in a searchable resource. So the idea is also making your data set available in a way it can be easily found. So one way to do is, for example, you can use repositories. And this repository, this is a Pangea repository, and this is one of the data set published in the Pangea repositories. So in the Pangea repositories, you can search the data sets, and we also have a mechanism where there are different metadata portal actually harvest the metadata, including Google Dataset Search. So by having this principle, you actually improve the visibility of your data because there are several ways through which the user can actually find your data set. So this is what the principle F4 about. All right, so if you are a researcher, how do you know where to put your data? You can actually look at r3data.org. This is a registry that provides lists different repository from different repository, more than 2,000 repository from different domains. Okay, so what is FAIR assessment? So as you can see, the FAIR principles are very high level. Therefore, they are subject to different interpretations. So, for example, there's one principle say that the data should be described with rich metadata. But what is rich metadata, right? Because it's subject to different interpretation. Different discipline will have a different requirements of the metadata. So what happened is that to ensure a systematic evaluation of data based on FAIR principles, several groups develop metrics. Sometimes they also call it indicator. So for example, this is a work from CSIRO. CSIRO is a research organization in Australia where they develop a set of metrics that correspond to the FAIR principles. And they also develop like a tool that allow user to check the fairness of their data set based on the metric. So in this case, for example, the principles say the data must be described with, should have a rich metadata. So the way they interpret this principle is that the data have some abstract and keyword, and so they have a different detail of which metadata should be made available to the user. So this is what we call FAIR assessment and the metric, using a metric, set of metrics. If you want to know existing tools that allow a user to access data set, you can refer to the FAIR Assist website. There is also a report, landscape report produced by the RDA FAIR Data Maturity Group. And in general, you can access the data, the data based on the principle manually. For example, using researchers or data stewards. You can do it automatically using machines, or a combination of both. So before I move to my second part of the talk, I just want to outline some important concept related to the FAIR principle. FAIR principle, they are not strict measures, so they are not like definite. They are more like a concept that should be further developed and implemented by taking into account requirements from different domains. So the biodiversity domain have a different requirement compared to the medical domain, for example. And important aspect when implementing the FAIR data principle is to take into account who are your stakeholders. Who will run the assessment? Who will benefit from the assessment? Who will govern the assessment? And when you can run the assessment, do you want to run the assessment as the data is deposited into data repository or when you collect your data? And the assessment mechanism, at present, most of the work focuses on the manual assessment through data author and stewards. Manual assessment provide more insight into the FAIR assessment, but it's not practically feasible. For example, we have in Pangaea, we have more than 380,000 data sets. But therefore, we need some automation there, like using computer to do the assessment automatically. But we also have a constraint because in order to do a fully automated assessment, all the resources have to be machine readable, which is currently missing because as we know, not all data or metadata are machine readable. And so in addition to the metric and the tool, non-technical solutions are important in implementing FAIR data, especially on developing, for example, policies and training, and also to raise awareness to the user. I think this is also an important aspect on implementing FAIR. So this is the workshop about open data. So what is the difference between FAIR data and open data? So FAIR principle applicable to any kind of data, publicly available data, as well as restricted data. Example, restricted data are data containing culturally sensitive information or confidential information. But what important point is that restricted data also can be FAIR as long as you communicate the condition or restriction on accessing and using the data explicitly. Yeah. All right, so I'm moving to the next part, which is fair assessment of research data in the context of the FAIR project. FAIR is a EU project started March last year. It's a 3-year project, and it has 22 partners, currently coordinated by the DANS in Netherlands. So the goal of the project is to foster fair data culture and application of FAIR in research data cycle by developing solutions. So that include focusing on the best practices, policies, tools, and as well as training and outreach activities. So I'm part of the work package 4, which focuses on the FAIR certifications, and we have 3 main tasks within the work package. So the first task is about fair assessment of data object, and the second task is about fair assessment as a repository. So it's more on the repository level. And the third important task in the context of this work package is looking at how we can engage with external repository and assist them in achieving COTRA-SIL certification. So COTRA-SIL is an international organization that provides course certification for data repositories. So that's the next few slides. I will cover more about the fair assessment of data object. In the context of this project, data objects refer to subset of research data because we focuses on the data coming from observation or experimental data. We exclude like software or workflow, which is also part of the research data. And what is trustworthy repository? Trustworthy repository refer to certified data repository whose mission is to provide reliable and long-term access to data. And we follow a use case driven approach. So basically our approach consists of 3 steps. First, we identify use cases and the stakeholder involved. Second, we develop requirements including metrics to assess data in the context of the use cases. And finally, we implement tools that allow the stakeholder of the use cases to actually evaluate their data. There are different stakeholders involved in FAIR implementation that include funder, research service provider, for example, data center and research infrastructures, standard body, for example, COTRA-SIL or any like a W3C, all these international standard bodies. And we have also data stewards, which refer to the research support staffs like librarians, data curators, publishers, and also policy makers like government agencies and institutions, which refer to the universities and libraries. So all these user group influence on the FAIR implementations. So we focus on the 2 main use cases. The first use cases is about researchers. These use cases, so if you look at the data publication, the first use case focuses on before you publishing data. So where the researcher can actually use the tool to get familiar with the principle so that they can actually aware about the requirement and prepare the data as well as the metadata that actually comply to the FAIR principle and deposit into the repository. So this use case mainly to raise awareness and to educate researchers. And we will test this use case with the DANS Easy repositories. This repository curate data set on a different domain, mostly social science like humanity. And the second use case is looking at the data that are already published out there. So for example, a repository, so this use case will actually include the automatic assessment to evaluate data sets that are already published. And for this use case, we will test with the Pangaea data repository. And Pangaea, as I mentioned before, we curate earth and environmental sciences data sets. So these are the two use cases which we will work in the context of this project. In addition to these two repositories, we will also invite 3 additional repositories from different domains to actually participate in the use case testing and implementation. So in general, we have developed 13 metrics based on existing work. Our plan is actually to iteratively improve and extend this metric by testing them and the related tool with the data center. So we are really taking a bottom-up approach. Just start with a simple list of metrics, test it with different repositories, get the feedback, and then further improve the metric and the tool. So for the use case 1, as I say, we also need to educate the user about the principles so that when the user submit the data, they actually provide information required to that required for data sharing and reuse. So this is an example of self-assessment tool. It's still work in progress. For the first use case where user actually can go to this website and then answer a set of questions corresponding to metric and then get a feeling that, okay, I have provided this information, but which are the principles I should improve? And the second one is the FAIR evaluation survey, which there is already a tool out there that automatically, to some extent, evaluate the data based on the FAIR principle. So you just need to put identifier, your metadata is automatically evaluate the data set in terms of FAIR principle. And we will adapt and reuse this tool as part of our second use case. So to conclude, the task I'm currently leading is to enable data object assessment based on the FAIR principle in trustworthy digital repository. So to achieve this goal, we have identified use cases. From the use cases, we actually formulate the requirements, including metric based on existing work. And then we will implement the metric in terms of a tool set that allow the stakeholder in the use cases to assess their data set based on the metrics developed. So these are some of the deadlines. So currently we are finalizing the metric and the requirements. As you can see, we have already started the implementation. And by August 2020, both use cases must be tested and implemented in the context of 2 repositories, Dance Easy repository and Pangaea repository. After that, we have still about a year actually to work with other repository and test our work. So if you are a data center, or if you actually manage a data system and you would like to participate in our study, please do not hesitate to contact us. And I also would like to promote some of the FAIR upcoming activity. So we are organizing, and there's an online seminar, and we also organizing a workshop as part of the IDDC International Digital Curation Conference. The registration is free. And to know more about FAIR, please visit the events and outreach activity as part of the portal. So, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anusuriya. Is there any question? I have one question. So I assume these tools, when you will develop them, they will be freely available online, so everybody will be able to use them. Yes. So you can just have to follow your webpage and there will be used.
I believe this slide also will be made online, so you can always contact me. And because I know there are also people from different projects, and if you think you would like to use the tool to test, because as I say, FAIR is a discipline dependent. Every discipline have a different way of working, different metadata requirements. So I welcome everybody to contact me if you want to participate as part of the pilot testing.